Women have just realized that feminism set men free, not women. After decades of reshaping society in ways that pushed men aside and labeled their natural ways of being as problems to be fixed, the hard truth is hitting everyone square in the face, and women are suddenly seeing the writing on the wall as the consequences of those choices start to pile up in ways no one wants to talk about openly, while men have quietly walked away, found real peace in their own lives, and show no signs of turning back around. So picture the scene where the very movement that promised liberation for everyone actually handed freedom to one side and left the other facing a mountain of realities they never prepared for. And if you stay with this all the way through, you will see exactly why this shift is permanent, why women are now calling for men to step back in and save the day, and why that call is not going to land the way they expect, because the game has changed for good. And understanding it might just be the sobering wake up we all need right now. And if you're enjoying these Angry Guy videos, you can show your support by buying me a Red Bull with a one time gift or via a monthly pledge using the link in the description of the video. Think about how it all unfolded over the years when the push for what was called equality started out sounding reasonable enough with promises of opportunity and fairness, but somewhere along the line, it morphed into something that systematically cleared men out of spaces they had always occupied and reframed basic male behaviors as issues that needed correcting, from the way men naturally sit or stand to the way they approach work or relationships. Everything got painted with the same broad brush of being somehow defective or harmful. And as that narrative took hold, men began to step back, not out of anger, but out of a clear eyed decision to stop pouring energy into situations that offered no real return. And instead, they started building lives centered on their own peace and purpose, which left a vacuum that society is only now beginning to feel the full weight of. And women who once celebrated that independence are now confronting the reality that trading partnerships with men for reliance on larger systems came with a price tag they did not fully calculate, because those systems are showing their limits, and the support that once flowed so freely is drying up faster than anyone predicted, leaving many facing situations they never thought would touch them directly. It is like watching a long chain of events play out, where the initial moves seemed empowering, but each step further along the path revealed cracks that grew wider until the foundation itself started to shift under the pressure of real world demands, and men who had been told their contributions were no longer necessary or even welcome decided it was time to redirect their focus toward things that actually built them up rather than tore them down. And in that process, they discovered a level of contentment that comes from simplicity and self reliance, which stands in sharp contrast to the growing unease on the other side, where the promise of having it all without, the traditional balances has started to ring hollow. And now there is this sudden turn where the same voices that once championed going it alone are beginning to hint at the need for men to return and shoulder some of the load again, but without acknowledging how the earlier decisions created the very imbalances that make that request feel so out of place. And what makes it even more striking is how the legacy of those changes persists even as the labels get dropped, because the expectations and the structures that grew out of them remain firmly in place, shaping how people interact and what they believe they are owed in relationships and in daily life. You can see it in the everyday struggles that pop up when the safety nets of modern convenience start to fray. And tasks that once seemed simple enough with a partner around become reminders of how much coordination and complementary strengths used to make life flow smoother, from handling basic repairs around the home to managing the logistics of daily responsibilities. Without backup, the weight starts to show. And it is not about one side being incapable, but about how the deliberate downplaying of natural differences left gaps that no amount of rhetoric can fill. And men who walked away did so after seeing the pattern repeat across dating work and social circles, where Their efforts were met with diminishing appreciation and increasing demands that never seemed to balance out. And instead of fighting that current, they chose the smarter path of investing in themselves, their health, their skills, and their own sense of direction, which has led to a quiet but profound transformation where solitude is not loneliness, but a space for real growth and focus. And that choice has ripened into something solid that they are not eager to trade back for the old dynamics. The sobering part comes when you look at how the broader systems that were supposed to replace those old partnerships are now straining under their own weight, with economic pressures mounting and resources that once masked the consequences beginning to run thin. And women who traded the give and take of mutual support for what felt like greater autonomy are finding that the state or the market or the social safety structures cannot replicate the reliability and the shared purpose that came from working alongside men in complementary ways. And this is where the begging starts to emerge, not in outright admission, but in subtle shifts in conversation where the narrative flips from independence at all costs to a call for balance and rescue. Yet the catch is that the underlying framework still carries the imprint of those earlier pushes for supremacy in certain areas without the accountability that true partnership requires. And men have learned through experience that stepping back in under those terms would only restart the cycle without any real change at the core. Consider the way society reframed roles over time, where women were encouraged to pursue paths that mirrored traditional male pursuits while simultaneously expecting to hold on to the protections and preferences that came with older expectations. And men responded by recalibrating their own involvement, pulling back from the chase in dating, and from overextending in other arenas because the returns no longer justified the risks and investments. And this withdrawal was not dramatic or loud, but steady and calculated, rooted in a clear assessment of what actually served their well being. And as a result, they have cultivated lives that emphasize minimalism and personal satisfaction over the constant pursuit of external validation or provision. And that shift has created a landscape where the absence is felt more acutely on the side that once took the presence for granted and now faces the reality of navigating a world that demands more self sufficiency than the messaging ever prepared them for. It is a hard truth to sit with, but the data and the patterns show that when the incentives get misaligned, the natural response is for people to seek out what works for them individually. And men did exactly that by finding fulfillment in hobbies, careers, friendships, and inner peace that do not require them to play the role of constant fixer or provider in unbalanced arrangements. And women, on the other hand, are encountering the limits of a system that promised endless options without the trade offs. And the result is a growing recognition that hard times have arrived in ways that highlight the value of what was set aside. Yet the request for men to step up again comes without the full reckoning of how the previous era dismantled the mutual respect that made those contributions worthwhile in the first place. And this is why the call feels hollow to many, because it still carries the echo of wanting all of the gains while shifting the burdens back onto the very group that was told their ways were the problem. As the conversation evolves, you start to notice how the push that began with good intentions around fairness evolved into a broader cultural shift that prioritized one set of outcomes over the natural balance that had sustained societies for generations. And the fallout includes everything from declining family formation to mental health strains that affect both sides but land differently when the support structures are no longer mutual. And men who opted out have gained a clarity that comes from distance, allowing them to see the bigger picture without the emotional pull of trying to fix what others refuse to acknowledge as broken. And they are not looking back because the peace they found in focusing on self reliance and meaningful pursuits has proven more rewarding than the endless negotiation of terms that never seem to land in equitable territory. The writing on the wall becomes clearer when you examine how the state that was positioned as the ultimate provider and protector has begun to show its constraints, with budgets tightening and promises that once seemed infinite now revealing their finite nature, and women who leaned into that arrangement are confronting the gap left when personal partnerships were devalued and replaced with impersonal systems that cannot offer the same level of care or consistency. And this leads to a moment of reflection where some voices start to question whether the full package of changes delivered the liberation it promised, or if it instead freed men to pursue their own paths while leaving others to grapple with the unintended outcomes. And yet, the pivot is not a complete reversal, but a selective one that seeks to retain the advantages while offloading the harder parts back onto men who have already moved on to a different chapter. In this space of transition, the men who have embraced walking away have done so with a sense of finality that stems from repeated experiences of being positioned as the default solution to problems created by the very shifts that marginalized their input, and they have turned that energy inward toward building resilience, simplicity, and a lifestyle that aligns with their core strengths rather than constantly adapting to external demands that shift with the cultural winds. And this has resulted in a generation or more of men who value their solitude not as isolation, but as freedom to explore what truly matters to them without the weight of unbalanced expectations. And that choice stands as a quiet but powerful statement that the old contract has been rewritten by default, and no amount of sudden appeals is likely to restore it without fundamental changes that address the root causes. You can trace the threads back to how certain movements gained momentum by highlighting real issues, but then expanded into territory that dismissed the complementary nature of male and female contributions. And in doing so, created an environment where men felt increasingly sidelined in decision making, family life, and social norms. And their response was not rebellion, but retreat into spaces where they could thrive on their own terms. And now, as the consequences of that imbalance manifest in everything from economic pressures to personal fulfillment gaps, the call for rescue rings out, but it meets a wall of men who have already invested in their own version of success and see no incentive to re enter the fray under the same terms that led them to exit in the first place. The raw reality is that feminism in its later forms handed men an unexpected gift by releasing them from obligations that had become one sided and burdensome, and men accepted that gift by stepping into lives of greater autonomy and purpose. And women who are now facing the harder edges of those changes are beginning to voice a desire for the balance to return. Yet the honesty required to make that happen is still missing because the privileges and the social superiority that were achieved remain desired even as the responsibilities get redirected. And this creates a disconnect that men have learned to recognize and avoid because they have tasted the freedom on the other side, and it has changed their outlook permanently toward prioritizing their own well being and the things that bring them genuine satisfaction. Society as a whole is feeling the ripple effects of these shifts, with birth rates dropping, mental health challenges rising, and daily life becoming more fragmented without the stabilizing influence of mutual roles that were once taken for granted. And men who walked away have found ways to navigate this new terrain by focusing on minimalism and self directed goals that do not depend on the old dynamics, and their peace is real and hard earned, which is why the sudden turn toward asking for intervention feels like an afterthought rather than a genuine course correction. And the sobering wake up call here is that the legacy lives on in the expectations and the structures, even when the labels fade. And that means the path forward requires more than a simple plea for men to come back. It demands a full acknowledgement of what was traded and what cannot be easily reclaimed. As the conversation continues to unfold, it becomes evident that the initial phases of change that aimed at leveling the field gave way to a phase where the balance tipped so far in one direction that the natural counter response was for men to disengage entirely and build parallel lives that suit their needs and strengths. And this disengagement has left a noticeable void in areas ranging from practical support to emotional reciprocity. And women who once championed the independence narrative are now encountering the limits of that approach in tangible ways, from managing households and careers without the traditional backup to facing the long term implications of delayed family formation. And the result is a growing awareness that the system they helped shape has delivered mixed results at best. And now the call goes out for men to re engage, but it does so against the backdrop of men who have already adapted and thrived in their absence. The straightforward truth is that men discovered through experience that pouring endless effort into pursuits that yielded little appreciation or balance was not sustainable. And they chose instead to cultivate inner strength and external simplicity, which has brought them a level of contentment that stands apart from the chaos of mismatched expectations. And women confronting the writing on the wall are realizing that the state they leaned on as a substitute is faltering, and the privileges they secured through earlier movements come with consequences that no longer feel optional. And this is where the plea for rescue emerges, yet it carries the same undercurrent of wanting to keep the gains while shifting the costs. And men who have found their peace are not inclined to accept that arrangement because they have seen it play out before and chosen a different road. Looking deeper into the patterns, you see how the cultural messaging around masculinity as something to be corrected or minimized led to men stepping back from leadership roles in relationships and society, and instead focusing on their own development and communities that value their contributions without the constant critique. And this has created a solid foundation for them that feels authentic and rewarding. And on the other side, the struggles with everyday tasks and long term planning highlight how the push for sameness ignored the practical differences that made partnerships effective. And now, the sobering reality is settling in that those differences were not defects, but assets that, when removed, left everyone navigating a less efficient and more isolating world. And the men who walked away did so with eyes wide open, and they are not turning back because the freedom they gained is worth more than the old roles ever delivered under the new rules. It all circles back to the core premise that the movement intended to liberate one group inadvertently set the other free to pursue paths unencumbered by the previous obligations. And as women see the hard times arriving, with economic shifts and social changes accelerating, they turn toward the idea of equity and mutual support once more. But the men who have embraced their new reality are clear that any return would require a reset that addresses the full picture rather than a selective rewrite. And this is the raw, authoritative view that cuts through the noise because it is based on the observable outcomes and the lived experiences of those who chose to walk away and find peace in the process. And the legacy continues to shape the landscape even as the conversation shifts toward reconciliation. The intensity of the situation grows when you consider how the state that replaced personal accountability with collective provisions is now revealing its limits in the face of mounting pressures, and women who enjoyed the benefits of that trade off are now facing the prospect of dealing with the fallout without the buffer they once had. And this leads to a moment where the narrative begins to soften on the need for men to return. Yet the underlying framework still holds on to the idea that the earlier supremacy in certain areas was justified and the responsibilities can be renegotiated. And men who have become minimalist in their approach and focused on what truly serves them are seeing through that and standing firm in their decision because the peace they have cultivated is not something they are willing to risk for a system that has not fundamentally changed its core assumptions. In the end, the story is one of cause and effect, where the push for certain outcomes created the conditions for men to disengage. And now the consequences are prompting a reevaluation that comes too late for the balance to be restored on the old terms. And the sobering wake up call is that men have found their path and they are walking it with purpose and clarity, which leaves the rest of society to adapt to the new reality without the expectation that the past will simply repeat itself. And that is the truth that rings out clearly when you look at the full scope of what has unfolded over the decades and what continues to unfold today. The patterns repeat in different forms across dating and daily life, where the withdrawal of men from constant pursuit has left a gap that highlights the value of what was once taken for granted, and women who position themselves as strong and independent are now navigating the practical challenges that come with that stance. And it is not a matter of blame, but a matter of recognizing that the complementary strengths were what made the whole system function effectively, and without them, the load shifts unevenly, and the men who stopped chasing did so after calculating the real return on their investment and finding it lacking. And they redirected that energy into building lives that align with their values. And that choice has proven to be a lasting one because it is grounded in reality rather than rhetoric. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. As more layers of the situation reveal themselves, it becomes apparent that the freedom men gained was the unexpected outcome of a movement that sought to elevate one side without fully accounting for the interdependence that had always existed. And now, as hard times test the limits of the new arrangements, the call for men to save the day emerges, but it meets a group that has already saved themselves by walking away and embracing a minimalist approach that prioritizes peace and purpose over the old obligations. And this is why the plea feels like it arrives after the door has closed and the men inside have settled into a new way of being that they have no intention of abandoning. And the authoritative view here is straightforward and raw because it rests on the observable facts of how society has evolved and how individuals have responded to those changes. And the women who are seeing the writing on the wall are right to recognize that the balance has shifted, but the men who found their freedom are right to hold on to it because the previous dynamic was altered in ways that cannot be undone with simple appeals. And the legacy lives on in the expectations that remain and the consequences that continue to unfold. And that is the sobering truth that demands attention if anyone hopes to navigate the future with clarity and realism. You can trace the threads through the cultural shifts that downplayed the role of men in providing stability and protection, and instead positioned them as optional or even problematic. And in response, men built their own stability through solitude and self focus. And that has created a divide that is not easily bridged because the peace they have found is authentic, and the struggles on the other side stem from the very changes that were championed without full consideration of the long term effects. And now, the pivot toward wanting equity after achieving what felt like supremacy reveals the inconsistency at the heart of the matter, and men who have walked away for good are not inclined to ignore that inconsistency in favor of returning to a broken contract. The full picture emerges when you consider the economic and social pressures that are accelerating the realization that the state cannot fully substitute for the mutual support that once defined partnerships, and women who leaned into the independence model are confronting the reality of what it means when that model meets its limits, and the men who opted out have already adapted by becoming more focused on their own paths and less available for the roles that were redefined without their input. And this creates a situation where the begging for rescue is met with the quiet resolve of those who have already rescued themselves. And the truth is that this shift is permanent because it is based on lived experience rather than temporary trends. As the layers of the situation keep unfolding, it becomes impossible to ignore how the economic realities are starting to bite in ways that expose the fragility of the arrangements that replaced old school mutual support with something far less reliable. And when you look at the numbers and the trends playing out across cities and households, you see women who once leaned hard into the idea that bigger systems could carry the load now, staring down rising costs, shrinking opportunities, and a safety net that is fraying at the edges because the money that fueled so much of the independence narrative was never infinite, and the state that stepped in as the ultimate backstop is hitting its limits with budgets stretched thin and priorities shifting under pressure from debt and demographic changes that no one fully accounted for in the rush to redefine everything. And men who walked away years ago already saw this coming from a mile off, choosing instead to strip their lives down to the essentials, focusing on skills that pay their own way and building buffers that do not depend on external promises that can evaporate overnight. So the sobering part is watching how the very group that celebrated breaking free from traditional roles is now confronting the cold calculation that going it alone works until the bills stack up and the support structures reveal themselves as temporary band aids rather than permanent solutions. And this is where the call for men to step back in starts to sound less like empowerment and more like a quiet admission that the trade off came with hidden costs that are now due. And yet, the men who found their footing in solitude and minimalism are not rushing to answer because they have already run the numbers on their end and realized that re entering under the old unbalanced terms would only drain the reserves they worked so hard to protect. Think about how the social landscape shifted when the emphasis moved away from complementary strengths toward a one size fits all approach that treated natural differences as obstacles to be overcome. And in that process, entire generations learned to view partnership as optional or even suspect, which left men with a clear choice to invest their time and energy where it actually yielded returns. And they did exactly that by turning inward toward hobbies that sharpen the mind, physical routines that build resilience, and social circles that offer real camaraderie without the constant negotiation of worth. And now, as women navigate the fallout of delayed partnerships and the practical challenges of managing life solo in an economy that rewards specialization over broad capability, the gap becomes more obvious because the rhetoric that painted men as optional overlooked the everyday realities where two sets of skills working together always accomplish more with less friction. And the raw truth is that men who embraced walking away did so not to punish anyone, but to preserve their own sanity and progress. And they have no interest in revisiting dynamics where their contributions were reframed as privileges to be granted or withheld based on shifting cultural moods. And this creates a permanent fork in the road where one side is discovering the limits of self reliance pushed to the extreme, while the other has settled into a rhythm that feels sustainable and free from the emotional overhead that defined the previous era. The straightforward reality hitting home now is that after achieving what felt like social superiority in many arenas, our women are quietly recalibrating toward a version of equity that still wants to hold on to the gains without fully owning the downsides. And you can hear it in the conversations bubbling up where the narrative flips from celebrating independence to highlighting the need for balance. Yet the underlying expectation remains that men should absorb the heavier lifting once again, while the structures that elevated one side stay intact. And men who have lived through the cycle recognize this pattern for what it is, a last ditch effort to keep the spoils without the full reckoning. And they have already moved on to lives centered on purpose over provision, where minimalism is not deprivation, but freedom from the treadmill of endless expectations. And the shift is not temporary because it stems from repeated experiences of being positioned as the default problem solver in a game whose rules kept changing. And the peace they have cultivated in solitude is the kind that comes from knowing your own value without needing external validation. So when the plea for rescue arrives, it lands on ears that have tuned out the noise in favor of what actually works for them long term. You start to see the bigger picture when you trace how the push for certain outcomes dismantled the incentives that kept partnerships functional, and in their place rose a culture that encouraged women to pursue paths that mirrored male achievement while still holding onto the idea that certain protections should remain untouched. And men responded by stepping back from the provider chase and the emotional labor that went unappreciated, which allowed them to redirect that focus into self improvement and interests that bring genuine satisfaction. And now, as hard times accelerate with everything from housing costs to career stability, feeling the strain, the women who traded men for the state are facing the moment where that state can no longer deliver on the scale it once did. And the sobering wake up call is that the legacy of those earlier changes lives on in the attitudes and the policies that still favor retaining advantages while shifting accountability. And men who have found their path in walking away are clear that any return would require a complete overhaul of those assumptions rather than a selective rewrite. And they are not interested because the freedom they gained has proven more valuable than the old contract ever was under its revised terms. It is like watching a slow motion unraveling where the initial promises of liberation sounded appealing enough, but each step forward revealed deeper dependencies on systems that were never designed to replace the human element of mutual reliance. And as those systems strain under their own weight, the conversations turn toward wanting men to come back and fill the gaps. Yet the honesty required for that to work is still in short supply because the core framework still carries the imprint of viewing traditional male roles as outdated or problematic while expecting the benefits to flow anyway. And men who opted for solitude and minimalism have already built lives that do not revolve around fixing what others broke, and they see the current pivot as another version of the same game where privileges are kept and consequences are outsourced. And this is why the disengagement feels so final, because it is rooted in a clear eyed assessment that the balance cannot be restored without addressing the root imbalances that led to the walk away in the first place. The intensity builds when you consider the practical fallout showing up in daily life, from the way households function to the way careers and communities operate, without the natural counterweights that once kept things steady. And women who embrace the idea of going it alone are now dealing with the reality that certain tasks and long term planning benefit immensely from complementary input that cannot be replicated by policy or markets alone. And men who walked away did so after calculating the personal cost of staying in unbalanced arrangements, and they chose instead to cultivate resilience through simplicity and focus, which has given them a buffer against the very pressures that are now surfacing. And the raw authoritative take is that this is not about one side winning or losing, but about recognizing that the experiment in redefining roles without regard for natural outcomes has produced results that demand adaptation on all fronts, and the men who found peace in their decision are not about to abandon it for appeals that do not acknowledge the full scope of what changed. As the discussion deepens, it becomes evident that the movement, which started with legitimate aims around fairness, expanded into territory that dismissed the value of interdependence, and in doing so, created conditions where men felt increasingly unnecessary in the eyes of the culture. And their response was to build parallel existences that prioritize their own growth and well being over the constant pursuit of approval in a system stacked against them. And now, with the state showing signs of overextension and the economic landscape shifting toward greater individual responsibility, the women who leaned into the independence model are encountering the limits in ways that highlight the gaps left by the absence of balanced partnerships, and yet the call for men to save the day still comes wrapped in the same selective memory that wants equity after supremacy without the full reset. And men who have embraced walking away for good understand that the legacy persists in subtle and not so subtle ways, and they have no intention of re entering a framework that has not evolved beyond its original flaws. The sobering truth that keeps resurfacing is that women are not being fully honest when they claim the past was necessary, but the future needs something different because the attitudes and the structures born from those decades remain firmly embedded, shaping expectations around accountability and contribution in ways that still tilt the scales. And men who have tasted the freedom of minimalism and self directed lives see through the rhetoric because they have lived the other side of the equation, where their efforts were met with diminishing returns and increasing criticism. And they chose the smarter route of investing in themselves, which has led to a level of contentment that stands in stark contrast to the growing unease on the other side. And this is why the begging for rescue feels misplaced, because it arrives after the men have already secured their own rescue through deliberate disengagement, and the peace they have found is not something they are willing to risk for promises that echo the same patterns from before. You can follow the thread through the cultural changes that reframed masculinity as something to be managed or minimized, which prompted men to withdraw from spaces where their presence was no longer valued on equal terms. And instead, they poured their energy into pursuits that align with their strengths and bring real fulfillment. And as a result, they have developed a lifestyle that is resilient and rewarding without the overhead of mismatched expectations. And women who are now seeing the writing on the wall with hard times arriving in the form of financial pressures and social isolation are beginning to voice the need for men to return. Yet the underlying desire is still to maintain the advantages gained while offloading the harder responsibilities. And the men who have walked away recognize this for the last ditch effort it is, and they stand firm because the freedom they gained was the unexpected gift of the very movement that sought to sideline them, and they have no plans to hand it back. The patterns continue to play out in ways that underscore the permanence of the shift. Because once men experience the clarity that comes from stepping back and focusing on what truly serves them, the old dynamics lost their appeal entirely. And this is especially true in an era where the state that was supposed to provide the ultimate safety net is confronting its own constraints with resources stretched and priorities realigned. And women who traded personal partnerships for collective provisions are facing the moment where those provisions fall short. And the practical challenges of life without the traditional balance become impossible to ignore. And yet, the pivot toward wanting mutual support again does not include a full accounting of how the earlier supremacy in certain areas contributed to the current imbalances, and men who have become minimalist and self reliant are not blind to this inconsistency, and they have chosen to stay on their path because it has delivered results that the previous setup never could under the revised rules. It all comes down to the core realization that the legacy of the changes endures even as the labels fade. And that legacy includes a set of expectations that still position men as the default solution to problems created by the very shifts that marginalize their role, and women who are confronting the consequences are right to notice the hard times. But the men who found their peace in walking away have already adapted by building lives that do not revolve around being the rescuer. And this creates a divide that rhetoric alone cannot bridge, because the trust in the old contract has been eroded by experience and replaced with a commitment to self preservation and purpose that feels far more solid than any sudden appeal for equity after the fact. And the raw truth is that this is the new reality everyone must navigate, because clinging to the old assumptions will only prolong the discomfort without resolving the root issues. As more aspects of the situation reveal themselves, the story becomes one of unintended outcomes where the pursuit of certain forms of liberation freed one group to pursue their own version of independence while leaving the other to grapple with the practical limits of a system that promised unlimited options. And now, as the economic and social pressures mount, the women who once championed the independence narrative are discovering that the state cannot fully replicate the reliability of mutual human support. And the men who opted out have already secured their own stability through simplicity and focus. And they see the current calls for rescue as a selective rewrite that wants to keep the gains while shifting the burdens. And this is why the disengagement is permanent, because it is based on a clear assessment of what works and what does not in the long run. And the sobering wake up call is that adaptation to this new landscape is the only way forward rather than hoping for a return to dynamics that no longer hold. The conversation keeps circling back to the fact that after decades of pushing men out of spaces and reframing their natural behaviors as issues, the inevitable result was for men to redirect their energy toward paths that offered real peace and progress. And they did that by embracing solitude as a strength rather than a weakness, and minimalism as a tool for clarity. And now, with women facing the brunt of the consequences in the form of destabilized support structures and mounting personal responsibilities, the plea emerges for men to step up once more, but it meets a group that has already stepped up for themselves in ways that do not require rehashing the past. And the authoritative view is that this shift marks a turning point where the legacy continues to influence outcomes, even as the narrative tries to soften, and men who have walked away for good are living proof that the freedom gained was worth the trade, and they are not looking back because the alternative has already been tested and found wanting. You begin to appreciate the depth of the change when you consider how the cultural emphasis on sameness ignored the practical value of differences that made partnerships effective. And in their absence, life has become more fragmented and demanding for those who bought into the idea that independence meant going it alone indefinitely. And men who walked away recognized early on that the game had changed, and they chose to play by new rules that favored their own well being over endless compromise. And this has led to a generation of men who value their autonomy and the peace it brings, which stands as a quiet but powerful counterpoint to the growing calls for balance that still carry the echo of wanting it all without the full cost. And the raw reality is that the women seeing the writing on the wall must contend with the fact that the men have already found their answer in disengagement, and any future collaboration would require a honesty that has been missing from the discussion so far. The full scope of what has unfolded shows that the movement in its broader form handed men an exit ramp they took without hesitation. And now, as the consequences catch up, the narrative is shifting toward reconciliation on terms that still favor retaining the privileges while expecting men to absorb the fallout. And this is where the straightforward truth cuts deepest, because men who have cultivated lives of purpose and simplicity are not inclined to accept that arrangement after experiencing the alternative, and they have built resilience that does not depend on the old roles. And the sobering part is realizing that the state, which was positioned as the reliable substitute, is now revealing its limits in ways that no amount of rhetoric can mask. And women who leaned into that trade off are facing the reality that personal partnerships offered something those systems never could. And yet, the men who walked away have no interest in filling the gap under the same conditions that led them to leave. And this is the permanent change that defines the current moment. In continuing to unpack the situation, it becomes clear that the legacy lives on through the expectations that women still carry, even as they call for men to return. And those expectations include holding on to the social superiority achieved in certain areas while shifting the accountability for the harder realities back to the group that was told their ways were the problem. And men who have found peace in minimalism and self focus see this for the inconsistency it is, and they have no desire to re engage because their lives have already been rebuilt around what works for them, and the freedom they gained from the original shifts has proven to be the most valuable outcome of the entire era. And as hard times test the limits of the new arrangements, the women confronting the writing on the wall are right to recognize the need for change. But the men have already changed in ways that make returning unlikely without a complete reset that addresses the full picture. And that is the authoritative raw take that brings the whole story into focus. The threads keep connecting back to how the push for supremacy in the name of equality created the conditions for men to disengage entirely, and now the plea for equity arrives after the fact when the men have already secured their own version of liberation through solitude and purpose. And this is why the begging feels like it comes too late, because the men have tasted the peace on the other side, and it has reshaped their priorities in ways that prioritize self reliance over the old obligations. And women who are now facing the destabilized support from the state are discovering that the independence they celebrated has its breaking point. And the sobering wake up call is that the legacy of the changes persists in the attitudes that still seek to keep the gains while offloading the consequences. And men who have walked away are not blind to this, and they stand firm in their decision because the alternative has already been weighed and found insufficient for the long haul. As the narrative evolves further, the practical realities of daily life without balanced input start to highlight the gaps in ways that rhetoric cannot cover. And tasks that once flowed with complementary strengths now require more effort and resources on one side alone. And men who opted for the walk-away route have already adapted by focusing on what they can control and building lives that do not hinge on external validation or provision. And this has given them a clarity that the current calls for rescue lack, because those calls still operate under the assumption that men will simply step back in without the fundamental changes needed to make it worthwhile. And the raw truth is that the freedom men gained was the direct result of the movement that tried to sideline them, and they have embraced it fully, which leaves the rest of society to adapt to the absence rather than expecting a reversal that is not coming. The intensity of the moment is undeniable when you consider how the economic pressures are accelerating the realization that the state cannot indefinitely substitute for the human element of mutual support. And women who traded men for that state are now confronting the limits in tangible ways that affect everything from financial stability to long term planning. And the men who have become minimalist and self directed have already navigated those challenges by choosing paths that align with their strengths, and the peace they have found is real and lasting, which is why the sudden pivot toward wanting men to save the day meets with the quiet resolve of those who have already saved themselves. And this is the sobering truth that defines the current landscape, because the legacy continues to shape the conversation even as the labels fade, and men who have walked away for good are living examples of why the shift is permanent. And the future requires everyone to face the new realities head on rather than hoping for the past to return unchanged. You can trace the evolution through the decades where the cultural messaging encouraged a view of men as defective or optional, and the natural response was for men to withdraw and invest in themselves. And now, as the consequences of that messaging play out in the form of fragmented support structures and mounting personal loads, the women who once pushed for those changes are beginning to see the value in what was set aside. And yet, the call for rescue still carries the undercurrent of wanting to retain the advantages without the full accountability, and men who have embraced their new reality are not interested in that bargain because they have already found something better in the freedom of walking away. And the minimalism that brings clarity and the authoritative take is that this is the wake up call that society needs to hear, because clinging to the old assumptions will only deepen the divide, while adaptation to the actual outcomes offers the only path forward. The story keeps building toward the understanding that the men who walked away did so with eyes wide open after seeing the pattern of unbalanced expectations repeat across multiple areas of life. And they chose instead to cultivate inner strength and external simplicity, which has delivered a level of satisfaction that the previous dynamic never matched under its revised terms. And women who are now facing the hard times, with the state faltering, are right to notice the writing on the wall. But the men have already written their own chapter, and it does not include returning to the role of default rescuer. And this is why the legacy of the changes persists as a barrier to easy reconciliation, because the attitudes that drove the original shifts still linger in the expectations and the structures, and the raw reality is that the freedom men gained is here to stay. And the sobering part is that everyone must navigate the new normal without the illusion that the past can be simply reinstated. In pulling all of this together, the core premise remains as solid as ever, because the movement in practice freed men to pursue their own liberation while leaving women to deal with the unintended consequences of a system that overpromised and underdelivered in the long run. And the men who embrace that freedom are not turning back, because the peace they have found in solitude and purpose is more valuable than the old obligations ever were. And the women who are calling for them to return must face the fact that the legacy lives on in ways that make any return conditional on changes that have not yet materialized. And this is the straightforward, authoritative wake up call that brings the entire discussion full circle, pointing toward a future where adaptation and realism replace the hope for easy reversals. And the men who have walked away stand as proof that the shift is real and lasting. Now, when you take a wider view of how these changes are playing out across the generations coming up behind us, it starts to hit you how boys who are entering adulthood today are absorbing the lessons from what has unfolded without anyone needing to spell it out for them, because they see the landscape clearly from the jump, where the old expectations around constant provision and emotional labor in unbalanced setups simply do not compute anymore. And instead, they are channeling their energy into building standalone capabilities, from career paths that reward personal mastery to social networks that value direct, honest exchange over performative dynamics. And this creates an even stronger wave of disengagement, because these younger men are not reacting to past grievances, but proactively choosing paths that align with what actually delivers results in the current environment. And on the flip side, the women in those same age groups are navigating a reality where the promises of endless options and effortless balance have run into the practical walls of real life timing and compatibility, which leaves them confronting choices that feel heavier than the messaging ever suggested. And the raw part is recognizing that this generational handoff is not reversible, because the foundational assumptions have been tested and found lacking in ways that reshape how everyone approaches relationships, work, and long term planning from the outset. So, the sobering truth settling in is that society is not going back to some idealized version of the past, but moving into a phase where each side learns to operate with the tools and mindsets that the shifts have forced upon them. And the men who pioneered the walk away are now watching their younger counterparts accelerate that momentum with a clarity that comes from seeing the full picture without the baggage of earlier illusions. It is fascinating in a hard edged sort of way to watch how the dating and relationship scene has transformed under these pressures, where The traditional chase has given way to a mutual standoff because men across the board have recalibrated their standards to demand reciprocity that matches their investment. And when that reciprocity does not materialize, they simply opt out, entirely redirecting their focus toward personal projects, friendships that energize rather than drain, and futures that they control without the variable of mismatched expectations. And this shift has created a market where the signals are unmistakable to anyone paying attention, because the women who once held the leverage of numbers and cultural momentum are now facing a pool of men who have grown comfortable with their own company and who refuse to engage in games that require them to prove their worth on terms that never balanced out in the first place. And the straightforward observation here is that this is not some temporary phase, but a structural change in how connections form, because the psychological freedom men have discovered through stepping back has rewired their priorities toward authenticity over performance. And that freedom feels so liberating after years of navigating setups that felt like uphill battles with moving goalposts, that they are not eager to trade it for anything less than genuine mutual value. And as a result, the entire ecosystem of meeting and pairing has slowed dramatically, leaving both sides to adapt in ways that highlight the cost of the earlier cultural experiments. And the wake up call is that pretending the old incentives still apply will only prolong the frustration, while accepting the new reality opens the door to whatever organic connections might still emerge under honest terms. The psychological side of what men have gained through this disengagement runs deeper than most conversations admit, because when you strip away the constant pressure to perform as the fixer or the provider in arrangements that offered little in return, what emerges is a mental clarity and emotional stability that comes from aligning your life with your own internal compass rather than external demands. That shift with every cultural win, and men who have embraced this path report a level of inner peace that stems from knowing their value is not tied to someone else's checklist, and instead they invest in routines that sharpen the mind bodies that stay strong through consistent effort, and minds that stay sharp through deliberate learning. And this creates a self reinforcing cycle where solitude becomes a space for genuine growth rather than a void to be filled. And the raw truth is that this psychological independence has become so rewarding that the idea of re-entering dynamics that once eroded that peace feels like stepping backward into a fog they have already walked out of. And for the women observing this from the other side, the sobering realization is that the independence they championed has produced men who are truly independent in ways that make appeals for rescue feel out of step with the actual human beings who have evolved beyond the old roles. And this is why any future bridging of the gap would require both sides to meet in a space of realism rather than nostalgia, because the mental landscape has changed permanently. And the men who have tasted that freedom are not about to surrender it lightly. Demographic patterns are starting to paint a picture that underscores the permanence of these shifts, because as men delay or opt out of family formation altogether in favor of lives that prioritize their own trajectory, the downstream effects ripple through everything from population trends to the way communities and economies function over decades, and younger cohorts are inheriting a world where the default path of early marriage and traditional roles has been replaced by deliberate choices to wait or forego altogether until conditions align with their newfound standards of self sufficiency. And this is not driven by spite, but by a clear calculation that building a stable foundation first makes more sense than rushing into setups that statistics and lived observation show carry higher risks of imbalance. And the authoritative take is that these trends are accelerating because the men coming up have the examples of those who walked away as proof that alternative paths deliver real satisfaction. And while some might view this as a crisis, the straightforward reality is that it is simply the outcome of a society that dismantled the incentives for mutual investment without replacing them with anything equally compelling. And the women who are now seeing these numbers play out in their own circles are confronting the fact that the equity they seek cannot be mandated, but must emerge from voluntary alignment that respects the independence both sides have developed. And until that alignment happens, the demographic momentum will continue in the direction set by the choices men are making today. Workforce and innovation landscapes are feeling the effects in subtle but profound ways as men who have walked away channel their talents into fields and ventures that reward individual excellence over collective conformity. And this redirection has sparked bursts of creativity in areas like technology, entrepreneurship, and hands-on trades where the freedom from outdated expectations allows for bolder risks and deeper focus. And you can see it in the rise of solo operators and small, tight knit teams that operate with efficiency and purpose because the men involved are not burdened by the need to balance external demands that do not serve their goals. And the sobering part for the broader economy is that this talent pool is no longer automatically flowing into traditional corporate or institutional structures that once relied on male drive as a given. And instead, it is coalescing around opportunities that align with the new ethos of self directed progress. And women who are navigating the same professional spaces are starting to notice the shift in energy and collaboration styles, which highlights how the absence of that complementary drive changes the overall output. And the raw observation is that society as a whole benefits when people are free to pursue what matches their strengths rather than fitting into molds that no longer hold. And the men who have embraced this path are proving through their results that the psychological freedom they gained translates directly into tangible advancements that the old system could not have extracted under the previous pressures. The calls for equity that are emerging now ring with a certain hollowness because they arrive after the fact when the structures that created the imbalances have already been internalized by both sides. And what they often propose is not a clean slate of mutual respect, but a version of a balance that still expects men to absorb the heavier loads while the gains from earlier decades remain locked in place. And men who have experienced the full cycle recognize this as another iteration of the same pattern, where responsibility gets reassigned without the corresponding reset of attitudes and expectations. And the straightforward truth is that genuine equity cannot be negotiated from a position that ignores the independence men have already secured through their disengagement and the psychological freedom that comes with it, because any attempt to force it back into the old framework will meet the same resistance that led to the walk away in the first place. And the wake up call here is that true adaptation requires both sides to acknowledge the new baseline where men operate as fully autonomous agents rather than default partners in a system that has not proven it can deliver fairness consistently. And until that acknowledgement happens, the appeals will continue to feel insincere to the men who have built lives that no longer revolve around filling those gaps. Looking further down the road, the long term societal restructuring that is underway demands a level of honesty that has been missing from the public conversation because as men continue to prioritize their own paths, the institutions and norms that once depended on their automatic participation must evolve or risk becoming relics. And this could mean everything from policy adjustments that reflect actual participation rates to cultural narratives that stop treating male independence as a problem to be solved and instead recognize it as a logical response to the incentives that were created. And the raw part is that this restructuring will not feel comfortable for everyone because it requires letting go of the idea that the clock can be turned back to a time when the balances felt more natural, and instead embracing whatever new forms of cooperation emerge organically from the current realities. And the men who have walked away are already living in that restructured space where their contributions happen on their terms or not at all. And the sobering reality for the rest of society is that fighting against this momentum will only waste energy, while learning to navigate it opens possibilities for whatever stable arrangements can still form in a world where independence is the default setting for a growing segment of the population. And the authoritative view is that those who adapt fastest will be the ones who thrive, because the shift is not a glitch, but the direct consequence of decades of choices that have now played out to their logical conclusions. The psychological freedom men experience in this new phase cannot be overstated, because it represents a fundamental break from the cycle of proving worth in environments that constantly move the goalposts, and instead they have stepped into a space where their decisions serve their own growth and the people they choose to keep close, rather than satisfying broad cultural demands that never quite added up. And this freedom manifests in everything from how they allocate their time to how they approach challenges with a calm confidence that comes from knowing they are not carrying the weight of unbalanced expectations, and younger men are inheriting this mindset as a birthright, which accelerates the change even further. And the women who are witnessing it from their side are starting to see that the independence they once demanded has produced men who are independent in a way that makes old style appeals feel disconnected from the actual human landscape. And the straightforward truth is that this psychological realignment is permanent, because once tasted, it becomes the new standard, and any future interactions will have to respect that standard rather than trying to override it with rhetoric that echoes the past. And the sobering wake up call is that society will only find its footing again when it stops treating this freedom as something to be reversed and starts treating it as the foundation upon which new understandings must be built. Demographic trends continue to reveal the depth of the transformation, because as more men choose paths that delay or redefine family formation, the overall population dynamics shift in ways that force institutions to confront the reality of lower participation rates in traditional structures. And this is not about blame, but about the natural outcome of men applying the lessons of self reliance to their most personal decisions. And the result is a slower, more deliberate approach to long term commitments that prioritizes stability over speed. And women in these cohorts are navigating the same extended timelines with their own set of pressures, which highlights how the earlier cultural pushes have reshaped the entire timeline of adult life. And the raw observation is that these trends are self reinforcing, because each generation sees the outcomes of the previous one and adjusts accordingly. So the men coming up are even less inclined to rush into setups that do not align with their observed realities. And the authoritative take is that this demographic restructuring is the price of the experiment in redefining roles without regard for the human element. And the only way forward is to build new norms that work with the independence that has taken root rather than against it. Innovation in the workforce is accelerating in pockets where men have redirected their focus toward ventures that reward autonomy and creativity, because the freedom from the old obligations allows for risk taking that was previously tempered by the need to maintain stability for others. And you can see it in the surge of independent creators, technical specialists, and small scale operators who operate with lean efficiency and high output, because their motivation is internal and aligned with their strengths rather than external validation. And this shift is quietly reshaping entire sectors, as the talent that once flowed predictably into larger institutions now coalesces around opportunities that match the new ethos. And women who are active in those same spaces are experiencing the change in collaboration and drive, which underscores how the absence of the old complementary energy alters the overall dynamic. And the sobering truth is that society benefits when people are free to pursue what matches their capabilities rather than fitting into outdated molds. And the men who have embraced this path are demonstrating through their results that the psychological independence they gained translates into broader progress that no amount of top down policy could have engineered. The calls for equity that surface in these discussions often carry an undercurrent of selective memory because they tend to focus on the desired outcomes without fully addressing the independence that men have already secured through their choices. And what they propose frequently amounts to a version of balance that still expects men to step into roles that no longer serve their self directed lives. While the structural advantages from earlier decades remain unchallenged, and men who have lived through the evolution see this as another attempt to renegotiate terms after the fact. And the straightforward reality is that genuine equity can only arise when both sides operate from positions of true autonomy rather than one side trying to pull the other back into a framework that has already been rejected. And the wake up call here is that the psychological freedom men have cultivated makes them immune to appeals that do not respect that autonomy. And until the conversation evolves to acknowledge this new baseline, the disconnect will only widen. Societal adaptation over the long haul will require a level of pragmatism that cuts through the nostalgia, because as the men who have walked away continue to build lives on their own terms, the institutions and cultural norms must adjust to the reality of reduced automatic participation. And this could look like everything from revised expectations around family and work to new forms of community that emerge from voluntary alignment rather than mandated balance. And the raw part is that this adaptation will not be painless because it means letting go of the assumption that the old dynamics can be revived through appeals alone, and instead embracing whatever stable structures arise from the current independence. And the men who pioneered this path are already thriving in that adapted space where their contributions happen on their terms or not at all. And the sobering observation is that those who resist the change will find themselves increasingly out of step, while those who learn to navigate the new landscape will discover opportunities that the previous era could not have provided. And the authoritative view is that this is the natural progression when a society tests its assumptions and then lives with the results. The generational differences are becoming more pronounced as younger men enter the picture with a default mindset of self reliance that skips the stages their predecessors had to learn through experience. And they are applying that mindset to every area, from career choices to personal relationships, where the priority is building something durable on their own foundation before considering any form of partnership. And this accelerates the overall shift because the cultural memory of the old imbalances is baked in from the start. And women in those generations are confronting a dating and social environment where the men they encounter are operating with that same clarity, which makes the old scripts feel irrelevant. And the straightforward truth is that this handoff is creating a new normal where independence is the starting point rather than an exception. And the sobering wake up call is that pretending otherwise will only lead to more frustration, while accepting the reality allows for whatever authentic connections can still form under the new rules. Psychological benefits continue to compound for men who have embraced this path because the freedom from mismatched expectations allows for a depth of self knowledge and emotional regulation that was harder to achieve when their energy was constantly diverted toward proving value in unbalanced setups. And they are using that clarity to pursue interests that sharpen their skills bodies, that reflect consistent discipline, and minds that remain unclouded by external drama. And this creates a virtuous cycle where solitude fuels growth and growth reinforces the choice to stay independent. And the raw reality is that this state of being has become so preferable that the idea of trading it for anything less feels like a downgrade. And women who are observing the outcomes are starting to see that the independence they promoted has produced men who are truly self contained in ways that change the equation for everyone involved. And the authoritative take is that this psychological evolution is the most lasting legacy of the shifts because it has rewired priorities at the individual level in a way that no policy or appeal can undo. Demographic and workforce implications keep unfolding in ways that highlight the interconnected nature of these changes because as more men opt for paths that emphasize personal mastery over traditional timelines, the flow of talent and family formation adjusts accordingly, creating new patterns in how economies and communities sustain themselves over time. And the sobering part is recognizing that these patterns are not anomalies, but the direct result of men applying rational self interest to decisions that were once taken for granted. And younger cohorts are inheriting this approach as standard, which solidifies the transformation. And the straightforward observation is that society will only stabilize when it stops fighting the current and starts designing around the independence that has taken root. And the men who have led the way are living proof that this path delivers results that the old system could not match under its revised conditions. In the end, the long term restructuring points toward a future where the balance, if it returns at all, will look nothing like the past because it will be built on the foundation of autonomy that men have claimed for themselves. And the women who are navigating the same world will have to meet them in that space rather than expecting a return to dynamics that no longer exist. And this is the raw authoritative truth that cuts through the noise because it rests on the observable outcomes of choices that have already been made and the psychological freedom that has already been won. And the sobering wake up call is that adaptation to this new reality is the only path that leads anywhere productive, while clinging to the hope of reversal will only deepen the divide that the shifts have already created. When you factor in the way technology and automation have quietly reshaped the entire playing field, it starts to become obvious how these tools have handed men the ultimate toolkit for true self reliance in a manner that locks their decision to walk away into something irreversible because smart systems now handle everything from household maintenance to financial tracking and even personalized learning pathways that once required external partnerships, or institutional support, and this has freed up mental and physical bandwidth for men to pursue mastery in areas that genuinely light them up without the drag of negotiating roles that never quite balanced out in practice. And the straightforward reality hitting everyone now is that as artificial intelligence and remote capabilities expand, men are doubling down on building lives that operate like well oiled machines of their own design where solitude is not a sacrifice, but the foundation for peak performance. And women who are turning toward appeals for men to step back in as the hard times deepen are running straight into this technological wall because the innovations that make independent living not only viable but superior have already been adopted widely by the very group being called upon, and no amount of cultural pressure can unwind the efficiency gains that let a man manage his world solo with less friction than the old interdependent models ever delivered under the revised rules that emerged over the decades. It is a hard edged truth to sit with when you examine the honesty gap that persists in the pivot happening right now. Because while some voices are softening on the need for balance, the underlying framework still refuses to fully own how the earlier pushes created the very imbalances now being felt, and instead frames the request as a mutual evolution, when in fact it carries the same selective lens that wants to preserve the social and structural edges gained while expecting men to absorb the practical fallout from systems that are straining under their own weight. And men who have already charted their course through this landscape see that gap clearly because they have spent years observing how the conversation evolves only when the consequences start landing unevenly. And the raw authoritative take is that without a complete admission of how natural differences were downplayed and complementary strengths were dismissed as outdated, the current calls will continue to ring as another version of shifting responsibility rather than sharing it equally. And this is why the disengagement holds firm, because the men involved have internalized the lesson that genuine progress comes from dealing with reality head on, rather than hoping rhetoric can paper over foundational mismatches that technology and time have only made more apparent. Looking ahead to the cultural fallout that is already taking shape, you can see how entire norms around family formation and community building are being rewritten by default as men channel their energy into alternative structures that value voluntary association over obligatory roles. And this creates ripple effects where younger generations inherit a blueprint that prioritizes personal sovereignty and measurable outcomes over abstract ideals that fail to deliver in practice. And the sobering part is realizing that this cultural rewrite is not a backlash, but a logical adaptation to the environment that was engineered through decades of redefining what counts as valuable contribution. And women confronting this new cultural terrain are starting to feel the weight of how those definitions left gaps that cannot be filled by policy alone, because human connections thrive on reciprocity that cannot be mandated. And the men who pioneered the walk away are now part of a growing network of like minded individuals who reinforce the value of this new normal through shared experiences of clarity and purpose that stand in contrast to the fragmented attempts at reconnection that still carry the imprint of the old imbalances. The role of human nature in all of this cannot be ignored because at the core, people respond to incentives, and the incentives that were created over time rewarded disengagement for men while promising outcomes that did not account for the natural drive towards self preservation and efficiency. And as a result, the patterns we see today are not anomalies, but the predictable outcome of a system that treated one set of strengths as optional while elevating another without the balancing mechanisms that kept things functional for generations. And the straightforward truth is that human nature does not bend to cultural narratives indefinitely, and the men who have embraced their path have simply aligned with what works at the most basic level by seeking environments where their efforts yield direct returns rather than diffused obligations. And this alignment has produced a resilience that makes the current appeals for rescue feel disconnected from the actual motivations driving behavior. And the wake up call embedded here is that ignoring this fundamental aspect will only lead to further disconnection, while acknowledging it opens the door to whatever new forms of interaction can emerge from a place of mutual realism rather than one sided expectation. What real accountability would look like in this context is something worth laying out plainly, because it would require a full reset where both sides examine the trade offs made and own the consequences without trying to retrofit the past into a more palatable present. And that would mean women recognizing how the push for certain forms of supremacy dismantled the mutual respect that made partnerships sustainable, and men continuing to hold the line on their independence until that recognition translates into tangible shifts in attitude and structure. And the raw reality is that such accountability remains elusive because the legacy of the changes still influences the conversation in subtle ways that prioritize retaining gains over full reckoning. And men who have walked away have already practiced accountability in their own lives by adjusting course when the old setup stops serving them, and they see no reason to abandon that practice for a version of equity that has not yet proven it can operate without the same selective blind spots. And this is the authoritative lens that brings the situation into sharp focus because it rests on observable patterns rather than hopeful assumptions. As global perspectives filter into the discussion, it becomes evident that the shifts happening here are not isolated but part of a broader pattern, where societies that leaned heavily into redefining roles are now grappling with the same unintended outcomes, from declining cohesion to economic strains that highlight the limits of top down social engineering, and men in various contexts are responding with similar strategies of self focus and minimalism because the core incentives transcend borders. And the sobering truth is that this global convergence underscores the universality of the response, where human beings adapt to misaligned systems by seeking paths that restore balance internally, even if that means stepping away from collective expectations. And women observing these wider trends are starting to sense that the writing on the wall is not a local phenomenon, but a signal that the model pursued has reached its natural limits, and the men who have already adapted are not inclined to reverse course because the peace and progress they have secured align with what works across cultures when incentives are allowed to function without ideological overlay. The long arc of societal evolution points toward a future where the divide either narrows through genuine mutual adaptation or widens into parallel tracks where each side operates with the strengths it has cultivated independently. And the men who have chosen the walkaway path have already laid the groundwork for thriving on their own terms through focused self development and networks that reward competence over conformity. And this future does not have to be adversarial, but it does require dropping the pretense that the old contract can be revived without addressing the core reasons it fractured in the first place. And the straightforward observation is that clinging to appeals without that foundation will only reinforce the separation, while honest dialogue that respects the independence gained could potentially seed new forms of connection that are stronger for having been chosen freely rather than assumed. And the raw wake up embedded in all of this is that the legacy of the past decades will continue shaping outcomes until that honesty becomes the default rather than the exception. Innovation in personal and professional spheres keeps accelerating for those who have embraced the new landscape, but because the freedom from unbalanced obligations allows men to experiment with ideas and ventures that prioritize scalability and personal fulfillment over the need to maintain stability for mismatched partnerships. And you see this in the rise of niche expertise areas where individual contributors operate with high autonomy and deliver outsized results because their motivation is intrinsic and unclouded by external pressures that once diluted focus. And women navigating similar professional arenas are encountering a dynamic where the energy and risk tolerance have shifted, creating spaces that reward different styles of contribution. And the authoritative take is that this evolution benefits the overall system when it is allowed to unfold without attempts to force old balances back into place. And the men involved are proving through sustained output that the decision to walk away was not a loss, but a redirection toward higher leverage paths that the previous setup could not have supported under its revised expectations. The final layers of the situation reveal that the women seeing the writing on the wall are correct to notice the hard times, but the path to addressing them cannot bypass the reality that men have found a sustainable alternative that delivers peace and purpose without the need to reshoulder roles that were systematically devalued. And this creates a moment of truth where the conversation must evolve beyond selective equity toward a deeper understanding of what mutual value actually looks like in practice. And men who have lived the full cycle are not interested in partial measures because their experience has taught them that partial measures only restart the imbalance. And the sobering truth is that the legacy persists as long as the attitudes do. And the only way to break that cycle is through a collective willingness to face the full picture without filters. And the raw part is that until that happens, the men will continue on their path because the freedom they have secured is too valuable to trade for anything less than real change at the foundational level. As all of these threads converge, it becomes clear that the core premise holds firm across every angle examined because the shifts that were intended to liberate one group ultimately provided the other with an exit that they have used to build something enduring. And the women calling for men to return must contend with the fact that any meaningful reconnection would require rewriting the rules in a way that has not yet been demonstrated. And the men who have walked away for good have already invested in a different vision of success that aligns with their strengths and the realities of the current world. And this is the authoritative, raw perspective that cuts through the noise because it is grounded in the outcomes we can all observe rather than the hopes that linger from earlier eras. And the future belongs to those who adapt to this new baseline rather than fighting to restore what no longer fits the evidence. The 1 hour gang, you made it all the way through. And if you are enjoying these angry guy videos, you can show your support by buying me a Red Bull using the link in the description of the video. What did you think about what was discussed? Do you agree? And leave a comment on the video sharing your thoughts. Like the video if you like it. Do not forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA men walking away in cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.